For as long as I've been creating material for Crappy Childhood Fairy, I've been inundated with messages from people on the autistic spectrum who also have complex PTSD, who are asking for resources from people who know about both conditions and can provide information about what's different, what's the same, and what do you do about it. And so today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Paul Micallef from Melbourne, Australia, who has a number of resources and online tools and a coaching service, provides emotional intelligence coaching, relationship coaching for people on the autistic spectrum. In this interview, we're going to talk about things including feeling different. What do we do when we can't understand what's going on with the people around us? They seem to be speaking a language we can't understand. And about what signs of complex PTSD are similar to signs of autism and which ones are different, and what is their origin, and is there an overlap there? And we're going to talk about something very important to people with trauma, which is emotional intelligence. And Paul is a coach who helps people with that and with relationships. Hi, Paul. Welcome. Thank you for joining me here.
Hi, Anna. Good to be here.
I've been wanting to talk to you for so long. I get hundreds of comments and letters from people who are on the autistic spectrum and who watch my videos about childhood PTSD and are really wanting to know, is there a formal connection? Some of the symptoms are very overlapping, some are not, but so many people keep telling me that they really want me to have content on autism, and I knew I needed an expert. And that's why I was really glad you could join me. Your YouTube channel, Autism Explained, is just the perfect mix of what it's like to have it and what is it? What is it? So thank you for being here.
That's all right. It's a very important topic. I've had lots of similar questions from my audience, many of whom also have a PTSD diagnosis. So for a lot of adults who discover that they're autistic later in life, the big question is, what is the difference? And specifically, how can I separate the trauma and actually start healing from that and letting it, leaving it behind and integrating it and all the healthy things, versus how do I accept my autistic traits and my autistic nature and identity and embrace that even further. So the complicating factor is that a lot of the behaviors and external signs look very similar. So it's quite challenging in that respect.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? What are the signs that are similar, but what is clearly not autism? What is and is not?
So the signs that are similar are essentially the challenges relating to other people in a natural way. So some viewers might be familiar with polyvagal theory, and the concept that our bodies literally go into survival mode and it becomes more difficult to relax and connect to the people around us. So, for one reason or another, we often learn, and I say we meaning, those of us on the autism spectrum, we often learn that the world is not a safe place. Especially the social world is not a safe place. It's not a place that I can predict. I don't understand the people in it. I don't understand how they behave or how to predict them or how I can keep myself safe. And that often leads to a large amount of anxiety, triggering that survival mode that is more focused on looking for threats in their environment than it is about trying to connect with the people that we want to form relationships with. So in the case of autism, that difficulty in connecting with others is more due to a difference in neurology. So I might see things differently. I might notice different things. I might be interested in different things. I might process information in different ways. And all of those things, when you add them all up, it means that my experience of the world is just quite quite a different experience than the majority of the people around me. And when I was younger, I used to wonder, how does everyone else know what to do? It felt like there was some kind of secret telepathic code that all the other kids just tapped into effortlessly, and I never knew what the answer was. It turns out there was no secret telepathic code. It's just that everyone else was following their instincts. And when the teacher said, would you like chocolate or vanilla? They all said chocolate, and I said vanilla. I'm like, how did you all know to say chocolate? Well, actually, they didn't know. It's just that they were more likely to do the same thing as each other. And I was more likely to take a step in the wrong direction and go, oh, how did I end up out here? Why am I the only one here? How have I accidentally distanced myself from my peers? Um, yeah.
Well, that's a lot of what you described does sound like having CPTSD, of just having a difference, being in a group, in some kind of gathering, and not and trying to understand, how does everybody know how to act here, and not
Mm,
knowing. And I think with CPTSD, part of it has something to do with culture. I grew up in a family where the parents weren't totally supervising things all the time, so I missed out on a little, like, just developmental stuff of how are you supposed to act in these situations. I wasn't 100% neglected, but I did feel like I didn't get the memo. And I now also know that part of that is dysregulation, of just that being in a social situation can be triggering. And when CPTSD symptoms are triggered, it's a little harder to kind of read the signs and be present and be alert and to connected to people. And
mm.
that's where I think the symptoms mimic what signs of autism, but the causes are different, aren't
Mm.
they? Can you talk a little bit about what
So,
is autism?
so there is a lot of overlap,
Mhm.
and because there is so much overlap, I think one of the best ways to get a sense of the difference is to talk about certain autistic behaviors that have nothing to do with trauma at all. So, for example, having atypical sensory profiles is extremely common. And what this means often is that we can get overwhelmed by everyday situations.
Mhm.
So, what that might look like is I'm in a shopping center and there's this incessant bleeping noise. This is a true story. In my local shopping center, every once in a while there's this incessant bleeping noise, and when I've asked people about it, you'll never believe the answer. The answer is they left the fridge door open. They have some kind of loading bay, and when they open the fridge door for a certain amount of time, it just starts beeping and beeping and beeping and beeping until they eventually shut it. But of course, they can't shut it until they finish loading it. And I talk to the staff and they say things like, oh, yeah, it's really annoying, isn't it? Like, it's more than really annoying. I lose the ability to function in these situations. It's overwhelming. It's sometimes even painful. Um, Similar situations often occur uh, as problematic issues at school due to noise, due to crowds, due to the inability to get away from sensory input, whether that's smells or other people, or having people talk to me. Is sometimes the information is too much information and it's feeling like my brain is getting overloaded and I just need to shut out everything. Now, there are some ways for me to do that um, in a moderate way, but once it gets to a certain level, then it starts becoming a more self protective unconscious process where my brain literally shuts down and I no longer have the ability to hear the information that's around me or to process the emotions. It's actually a quite relaxing state sometimes. It's almost as if all my emotions just get switched off and suddenly everything's really relaxing, and the stress that was around previously just seems to not be processed anymore. So none of that has anything to do with a traumatic experience, yet it's the output is similar because we are becoming overwhelmed from the situation itself.
Oh, yeah. That There are parts of that that also remind me of CPTSD. I could see why people feel like they're the same thing. But I know you have a really amazing and powerful video that helps people just sort of self-assess, might it be autism? What are the signs that you suggest people look for to consider this?
So most people have, just from culture and from watching TV, a bit of a distorted view of what autism actually is. So the challenging part is that autistic behavior is human behavior, and we all have a little bit of the behaviors and the what you might call symptoms of autism, leading some people to make unhelpful claims like we're all a little bit autistic. So it helps to look at what are the key things that we're looking for, and most of those are around the ability to relate to your peers, feelings like I'm the only one who could possibly understand my situation, um, feelings like when I explain that this noise is painful to me, when I explain that no, I literally can't eat that food because it's disgusting, even though everyone else seems to think it's okay, and other relatively extreme sensory reactions. For a lot of my life, I didn't tell people about those experiences because when I tried, they either they either told me that they could understand when they clearly couldn't, or they essentially told me I was exaggerating and it could not possibly be that bad. Um, there was a young woman from the UK that I interviewed as part of a summit recently, and she was telling me how she went to hospital, right, for severe pain, and they told her go back home and come back if it gets worse. She's like, how could it possibly be worse? The reason I'm here is because I can't deal with this at the moment, but because her outward signs didn't seem like they matched the level of the pain, then it's hard for people to believe how serious the situation is. So when I'm asking people to self-reflect, and I feel like this is a very useful way to assess if you're on the spectrum or not, because the external behaviors are so uh, difficult to read, and so easily mistaken for typical behaviors. It's feelings like that I described, that no one else understands you. Um, and also, it's the experience of relationships breaking down for reasons that you can't quite put your finger on, and having that feeling that there's no one, I'm not going to be able to find anyone who can deal with me. Um, it's like trying to find a soulmate when you're the person you're looking for just feels like they're not one in a million, they're one in a million billion. And how are you going to find someone who can put up with your idiosyncrasies when they are so far outside of what most people consider normal?
I want to ask you about emotional intelligence but before I do, I wanted to ask your opinion because I know people come to you and say, I have both complex PTSD and autism. And how frequent is that? I have a lot of people who say they have both. And what they've told me is, well, growing up with autism, I was punished severely. I was treated like I was doing all of this on purpose, being different. And I was bullied at school and developed complex PTSD, which is the kind
Mm.
that comes from chronic, ongoing, intense stress. So that makes sense to me. What do you think about that? Is are they overlapping because of that?
Um, it makes sense in theory that could happen. What we do know is that due to various social challenges, autistic people, especially children, are often the targets of bullying or other um, negative social behavior, because it's harder to defend ourselves socially when we don't have that awareness that's quite as well built in. So it's with that in mind, the chances of having adverse childhood experiences in general are much higher. And without, I'm not an expert on CPTSD, but we know that, you know, ongoing negative experiences are a big factor. And when I was researching to make, so I made a video on the difference between autism and PTSD, and one of the things that I found in that was that if you consider trauma from the definition of something that you cannot cope with, rather than a specific type of action or event or situation, then we do have a lot of situations that we cannot cope with at all. So, is it possible that that literally causes, that is a source of trauma? It seems to be plausible, and that's about all I'm going to say about that.
You remain agnostic. I know you had a summit recently, and there were several speakers who were speaking about trauma, so it was relevant for your audience. It was
Definitely
a
relevant,
summit
yeah.
about autism with speakers on trauma. So, what were the
Yeah, so
important intersections?
the important intersections is that when we learn, and this has been my whole life's insight, is that when we learn how our bodies work, how emotions work, and my definition of emotions are a physiological state in your body. That's the most helpful way to think about it. When we know how our body works and what uh, the feedback loop looks like, then we can, number one, start to understand what it means. So there's a difference between the stress and the stressor, for example. So now that I know that, I can notice, hey, I feel really stressed and anxious right now, and I can know I can't see anything in my environment that is telling me that I should be stressed and anxious right now. That's interesting. So the first thing I do is look for, is there anything causing the stress right now? And if the answer is no, then I can go about, okay, well, the stress is real. I need to deal with it. I'm not going to tell myself I'm crazy because shouldn't feel anxious or shouldn't feel stressed. That's not very helpful. Instead, I can say, well, what can I do for my body that I know it responds to help change the physiological state of my body into something that is either more pleasant or more productive or more resourceful in a certain situation. Similarly, when advocating and trying to help others understand autism, one of the analogies that was a highlight of the summit was the idea of you're going on a hike, and your partner turns the corner and sees a bear and freezes out of fright, but you haven't seen the bear yet. So just because we don't see what someone is reacting to doesn't mean it's not real. It's just that we don't know what they're reacting to. So, especially for children, this is a very helpful way of understanding autism and understanding autistic behavior, because the reactions are not random. The reactions are not the problem in itself. They're a reaction to something, and they're largely not something that we have control over directly, at least. So when we realize we don't directly control our emotions, what we do control is our environment and our reactions to manage those emotions.
That sounds a little bit more structured than what I think happens in a CPTSD mind.
Mm,
It's just like so much chaos, the chaos I relate to, and then bringing it back. People have different methods. One of them is physical, one of them is like through writing and words.
mm,
And a few people I think can do it just by making a decision to think differently, but that becomes so hard in the dysregulation that goes with complex PTSD.
mm.
So I wanted to ask you, I know that you're an emotional intelligence coach, and that sounds so important and valuable. And I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you do that. How do you help people with that?
Um, well, it starts with the understanding of the system that we're dealing with. And then from that, everything that you've probably already heard about emotional intelligence, things like self awareness is important, things like these are some emotional regulation strategies, um, we start to be able to have a framework to put them into so that we can build them into habitual behavior so that they become more like passive skills rather than active skills. So if we take self-awareness, for example, I can consciously stop and do a body scan or stop and notice my thoughts or notice how I'm feeling in a particular situation. And that's fine. And that's a really good way to practice. But ultimately, what I want to be able to do is have that working constantly in the background as a passive skill so that when I'm talking to a colleague at work and I'm starting to get really frustrated, I notice that I'm starting to get really frustrated before other people do. A lack of it's very common to have a lack of social awareness and a lack of our own emotional a lack of awareness around our own emotional state, which is very problematic socially because it means that other people know that we're frustrated and upset before we do, and we don't have much of a chance to change the behavior, to change the outcome of that. And all of a sudden, I'm frustrated or screaming at someone or, um, making black and white demands of we absolutely have to do it this way, or I'm walking off this project, something fair that is actually quite extreme in hindsight, but it feels justified in the moment because of my emotional state in the moment. So if I can more quickly notice my own emotional state, then I can make better decisions on how to manage that emotion. It's also much more akin to an exponential self reinforcing feedback loop than it is to anything linear. So when we catch our emotions while they're small, it's a lot easier to deal with them compared to waiting until it's a full blown meltdown or I'm just not coping at all, and then the work to slowly go back down that spiral and calm down is much greater. And in the case of autism, the social stuff is also incredibly important. So the next step after, so from an emotional intelligence perspective, the next step after becoming self-aware and learning strategies to regulate my own emotions is starting to use very similar strategies to become aware and notice and regulate the emotions of other people.
Mm.
So it might sound a little bit strange to manage the emotions of other people, but this is a key social skill, and it becomes especially important in relationships. How do I deal with my partner when they're emotional? My partner's really angry, not at me, but just frustrated at work or something else. How do I deal with that? Or my partner's really upset, or what if they're disappointed in me? How do I notice that and help them to manage their own emotions? Um, so it's an incredibly powerful skill set to get by in the world, precisely because what it affects is probably the two most important things in our lives. Number one, how we feel and how we function, and number two, how we get along with other people. So yeah, that's, you can tell that I'm quite passionate about this. This has been a special interest of mine for a very long time. And it all started because I was just not having any success in these areas, and I needed to, for survival, I needed to figure out how to manage my own emotions, and for survival, I needed to figure out how to have relationships with other people, so that I wouldn't always end up on the outside of society, which becomes ironically more of a problem the older we get. Children kind of get away with it a little bit, but as you get older, suddenly not being on good terms with your family, not having a job, not having a partner, not having a good social network become a whole lot more critical in terms of the well being of the individual.
And you're married, correct?
I am.
And and your wife is not on the spectrum, I believe. Is that
Uh,
so? And you're
correct.
able to help her manage her emotions? I just think that's amazing. I everybody would like to
I,
know how to do that.
without divulging too much personal information, yes, I regularly help her manage her emotions.
Well, my husband does it for me too. But I'm wondering, are there any tips that you have for that to help another person self-regulate?
Um, I will share one tip that is probably the most important thing to focus on in the beginning, especially, and also a very counterintuitive one. When someone else is very upset, we need to manage
Mhm.
ourselves in the situation, right? So, a good example of this is, if someone twice my size breaks into my front door holding a knife and screaming at me, the first thing I need to do is manage myself because I'm going to be freaking out in that moment. I'm going to my own emotions are going to be absolutely scattered and crazy. So dialing that back to a more everyday situation, if my wife comes home and she's really upset, or worse, she's upset at me for some reason, not that that would ever happen, then I need to manage the stories that I'm making up about what is happening in this situation. What do I think these emotions mean, and what secondary emotions am I feeling? Because when I saw this little bit of sadness, I'm imagining it means, I don't know, something extreme, like she's upset with me and she's going to leave me, or something extreme like that. So to deal with the emotions of someone else, the first thing we need to do is notice the effect that their emotional state has on us and manage that first, to be receptive to engage in their emotional state. Otherwise, what we'll probably inevitably end up doing is trying to bring their emotional state back into a realm that does not upset us. So a child is really upset and it's upsetting me, and that's why I want to make them feel better. Whereas if it's not upsetting me, I can let them cry and let them get it out and do whatever they need to feel better. And it's about helping the other person rather than helping me. If someone is very angry or emotionally upset for some reason, it might not be the best thing to try and get them out of that state into another state. Maybe they need to be angry. Maybe they need to vent. Maybe they need to, whatever it is that they need to do, if it's in a healthy way to process and get through their emotions. I need to be managing myself so that I can allow them to do that. Um, and if I skip that step, I'm likely to try and force them to be into an emotional state that is comfortable for me rather than helpful for them, if that makes sense.
Mhm. You have you have a very calming voice about it. I can imagine that it's good to be around. And that so th it couldn't have been natural for you to be this calming presence for people. It sounds like it's something that you cultivated. And what was your journey with
Um,
that?
Emotional intelligence is less of an intelligence and more of a skill. Like we use that word intelligence quite broadly to mean a lot of different things, and it can be more helpful sometimes to think of it as a skill set that you practice. You can't learn emotional intelligence by reading a book. You can't learn self-awareness by reading a book. um, Brene Brown has a nice analogy around this. She's like, it's not an attitude, it's a
Mhm.
practice. Like you don't just walk around in yoga pants saying I've got a yoga attitude if you've never actually practiced. Like there's a big difference between an attitude and a practice. Um, so so my journey went from, when I was younger, I was watching everyone around me from the outside, trying to figure out what was going on. And I had very little success. And the key came from when I suddenly found myself on the inside of these social groups, having firsthand experience of random conversations with strangers and of relationships of all sorts. And it was through the practice that we become confident. It's a common trap for a lot of us on the spectrum to rely too heavily on our intellect and rational decision making. And that is just too slow for social interaction. Even if you have a lot of practice, that what it feels like is a great deal of burden trying to track all of the conversations and all of the emotions because you're trying to track it consciously. We have, you know, a brain dedicated to doing that. Our emotional brain does that day in, day out with very, very little effort. So, what we need to do in that sense is train our emotional brain to do all of these things for us in the background without any effort, so that we can leave the rational analytical stuff for a very small amount of surface level optimization rather than doing all the grunt work of keeping track of conversations and relationships and emotions and being aware of everything and all of that background stuff that needs to be done all the time.
I'm wondering, based on what you know, especially among your clients who may have had a lot of trauma, do you think that people on the spectrum need any sort of modified approach to healing trauma? I mean, people do it different ways, but what is important for an autistic person who has CPTSD? What's important for them to keep in mind about other people's methods?
Um, Short answer, yes. A person, an individual on the spectrum, um, seeking treatment of any kind, probably needs an individualized approach. I'm just scanning my memories and experience for if there is something that usually works better, and nothing strong is coming to mind. Um, However, it is likely that just because something works for someone else, it's not necessarily going to work for me. For a lot of people that I've coached, uh, more cognitive based things haven't worked particularly well. And I suspect that's because they're a lot more popular. And so that's the first thing that everyone tries. And instead, more physicality based therapies and ways to regulate our emotion tend to be more helpful. I wouldn't say that's always a general rule, but the message is there are a lot of different ways, and that self awareness around what works for you has to be the guide of how we go about this process, rather than relying on an expert who's worked with 1,000 other people who aren't me. Just because it's worked for 1,000 others doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for me without any modification at all.
Well, it seems to me that the two big elements that fit both challenges of complex PTSD, autism is the need for self-regulation
Mm.
and the need for emotional intelligence, which for different reasons gets sent off track a little bit in our development. Now,
Mm.
is autism, as I understand it, it's something you're born with. It's not caused by trauma. Is that so?
Yeah, so that's a key difference. That autism is a neurological developmental condition. So you're kind of born with it, I guess, but it's more like you're born with the DNA that eventually develops over your life, especially in childhood. So that's why we don't always see autistic behavior straight away necessarily, because it affects how we develop. And when we hit these different developmental stages, we might experience those stages differently. So um, with that in mind, yes, you're born with autism. and everyone's brain develops differently. And the autistic brain tends to be less focused on the social aspect, less focused on copying other people naturally, and tends to feel a bit less in tune with that. The other thing that we start experiencing very early on is that our developmental journey is often quite different, and it's not different in the same way for every individual. Quite the opposite. Every individual is completely different, and to give you a concrete example of this, talking in full sentences at the age of 2 is a sign of autism. Not talking in full sentences at the age of 5 is also a sign of autism, right? So um, we can be either very far ahead or very far behind in any given area, and possibly far ahead in some and far behind in others. And this is part of the difference in development that leads us to have difficulty interacting with peers. I had a story of she was telling me about her daughter coming up to her at the age of 2 and saying, "Mummy, why aren't the other kids talking to me? I talk to them and they don't talk back. What's wrong? Do they not like me?" And how do you explain to a 2-year-old that the reason the other kids don't talk is because they haven't learned how to talk yet? It's not that they don't like you. So she would prefer to go and play with the 6-year-olds and talk about, unicorns and Harry Potter and things. And so even at such an early age, all of a sudden her social development has been massively disrupted because she can't interact with her peers because they can't talk yet.
Wow. Is the beginning of romantic relationships another milestone where people become aware of autistic signs?
Yeah, I guess romantic relationships, due to their increased intimacy, lead us to see parts of ourselves that others have never seen before, that we have never seen before, that we've never shared with another person before. So there's definitely an additional layer of self discovery that comes from that. Um, so,
I know for in with CPTSD, romantic relationships can just suddenly, like, everything that was ever hard just can get a lot harder. Well, first it feels easy and great, and then it gets a lot harder. All the abandonment triggers and boundaries and all that stuff starts to get pushed and challenged, and so then the
mm,
panic responses can come out, the dysregulation can come out, or the urge to flee or fight or fawn or freeze. So I
mm.
was just wondering if there are, like, developmental stages that are parallel that bring out the best and worst.
So there are, so yeah, it definitely brings out the best and worst. Um, you can imagine that if you have been desiring a certain level of connection that you've never experienced before, it's only natural to put up significant barriers to protect yourself from the hurt of that rejection of that I haven't felt as included as I want. So, unfortunately, the flip side of having such effective self protective mechanisms is that it's a little bit black and white when we try and let go of those mechanisms. So, most people don't like me at all and don't want to spend any time with me. You do want to spend time with me, so I want to spend 100% of my time with you all the time. Problematic for a relationship. And in a similar way, the closer we get to someone, the more we have to be in tune with that person. A good analogy for this is like dancing, right? I can be dancing over here and you can be dancing over there and everyone's happy. As soon as we get closer and closer and closer and closer, suddenly I can't do whatever I want anymore. Suddenly, because of the relationship that I'm in, my previous coping strategies, my previous emotional regulation strategies are causing problems in my relationship. I need to get up and stretch every morning, but now I do, and I elbow my partner in the head. So I need to find a different solution which means my previous way of regulating myself and coping and surviving in the world is no longer working in this situation. And that's why intimate relationships are quite challenging, but also they teach us to face what we are struggling with, and hopefully in a healthy relationship give us the support and encouragement that we need to get through that as well.
All right, I've been asking just freestyle questions here. Are there questions that are really important for me to ask that I've missed?
Something that I was going to say before, you asked about being born with autism, compared to CPTSD. And one of the challenges with that is that with development, a lot of development occurs, in the first couple of years of life, which means that if you're experiencing trauma in those first couple of years of life, which also significantly affects your development, it can be hard to tell from a historical perspective, is this development due to something I was born with, or is this development due to an experience that has knocked me off my developmental journey? Um, so that's a question that a lot of people ask, and that's the best answer I've found anyway.
Mm. Is there anything else I should be asking you about?
What comes to mind is the concept of what do I do with this information? And my answer is we heal from trauma and we embrace autism. So there are some parts of myself that are key to my personality, and I would not be the same person without them. And there are some parts of myself that are sort of inflicted on me from hurt and damage from a past situation. And so it's a similar process integrating both of those aspects. And it can be helpful to think about what we want how we want to write the rest of our lives into the future. What do I want to take with me? What do I want to leave behind? Which parts of my history are integral to my identity? Which parts of my behavior and my preferences are integral to my identity? And what would I like to do instead? You can tell that I'm a life coach and I'm very future focused, and we get to choose these things. Once we realize the reality of the situation, we can start answering questions like, what would I like to take with me and what would I like to leave behind?
What kind of people are well suited to be your coaching clients?
So probably if you are thinking that emotions don't make sense, if you're thinking that emotions are difficult to recognize, and you are analyzing situations over and over in your mind, trying to find what can I possibly do differently. If you feel like you've tried everything you can think of to try already, then what I'm really good at is identifying the pattern, identifying the paradigm that we're working within, and then breaking out of that paradigm. So, this is especially true in our relationships. I really love the analogy of a dance in our relationships. So I take one step to the left and we're already 20 steps ahead because we've done this dance so many times. I do this, you do this, you do this, I do this. And you're reacting to my 20th step, not my first step. So we need to break those patterns and step out of the paradigm instead of simply thinking of it as a linear scale, more connection, less connection, reaching out more, reaching out less, pushing harder, pushing less. we can actually step out of that completely and transcend that, for lack of a better word, to radically change the pattern that we're working within.
Great. Where can people find you online?
My YouTube blog, main YouTube blog, is called Asperger's from the Inside. And you can go to paulmicallef.com.au, and that has links to a couple of different projects that I'm working on at the moment. Everything from helping autistic adults and partners of autistic adults with relationships and emotions, to teaching parents and teachers about autism, to help us all to understand our autistic children and to create the environments that allow them to succeed.
Mm,
So, one of the questions I get the most in my coaching work is around building emotional connection with someone who does not easily connect emotionally, might be a little bit withdrawn emotionally. So, I have a YouTube video called Why Do Aspies Sometimes Withdraw, or Aspie Withdrawal, or something like that. And there's a freebie along with that called What to Do When He Won't Text Back. So that's a free download. And in that is a lot of practical strategies around how to reach out to someone and build that connection and build that intimacy without forcing them, without overwhelming them. And there's a structure called How to Make an Open Invitation with No Expectation.
great. I'll include a link in the description section below this video for that so people can find it. I have a feeling that autistic or not, those are tools that a lot of people would find helpful. Thank you so much. I think this is a conversation that's going to evolve over time, simply because I know you have so many people who have traumatic experiences. I have so many people with autism. And I appreciate that you spent so much time in the summit that you recently created covering trauma and what that is and how it affects people, and the polyvagal theory and things that can be life changing for people who were going around thinking it's just them having these symptoms.
Mm,
It's so freeing when you find out it's not just you. You're normal. You're normal for how you're wired, or and for what
mm.
happened to you. And it's a liberating experience to find out. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, that day of the autism summit around trauma was by far the most popular. So it just goes to show how much interest there is in this topic, and how helpful these kind of resources and this kind of information is if someone is trying to unpack autism and trauma and figure out what they can do to start rebuilding their lives.
Thank you so much. Everyone, you can find links to Paul Micallef's work down below in the description section.